Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Josh, and I took over the narration from Philip. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's video, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The highway along Fonte River runs quiet most nights, especially past midnight when the streetlights dim and the jungle presses close on both sides. Drivers who take this route regularly know to keep their windows up and their eyes forward, not because of crime or wildlife, but because of something else entirely. Something that appears without warning on the shoulder of the road, drenched and desperate, wearing a wedding dress that should have dried decades ago. Marco Delgado saw her for the first time on a Thursday in late September, and what happened in the 3 minutes that followed would change the way he understood the island forever. Marco had been driving delivery trucks for nearly 15 years, and the Fonte River Road was part of his regular route between Hagotnya and the southern villages. He knew every curve, every pothole, every place where the asphalt cracked and the jungle tried to reclaim the pavement. On that particular night, he was running late after a delayed pickup, and the clock on his dashboard read 2:37 in the morning when he rounded the long bend near the old bridge. The air was humid and still, the kind of thickness that clings to your skin even inside an air-conditioned cab. His headlights cut through the darkness in twin beams, illuminating the road ahead in stark white light. That was when he saw her standing just beyond the guardrail, one hand raised as if flagging him down. At first, Marco thought it was an accident victim. The woman wore a long white dress that gleamed unnaturally in his headlights, and her hair hung in wet tangles down her back. She stood perfectly still, her arm extended, her face obscured by what looked like a veil or a curtain of fabric. Marco slowed the truck instinctively, his foot easing off the gas as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. There were no other vehicles on the road, no signs of a collision, no broken glass or skid marks. Just the woman in white, soaked through as if she had been pulled from the river itself. He rolled down his window halfway, the humid night air flooding into the cab, and called out to her. She did not respond. She only stood there with her hand raised, her dress dripping water onto the dry asphalt in a steady, rhythmic patter that he could hear, even over the idle of his engine. Marco felt a prickling unease settle into his chest, but he told himself it was nothing, just someone in trouble who needed help. He had seen strange things on these roads before, drunken tourists, disoriented hikers, people who wandered too far from their cars. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder and stepped out, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. The moment his boots hit the pavement, the temperature seemed to drop. It was subtle at first, just a coolness that brushed against his arms and neck, but within seconds it became a bone-deep chill that made him shiver despite the tropical heat. The woman had not moved. She stood exactly where she had been, her arms still raised, her veil hanging over her face in a way that made it impossible to see her features. Marco approached slowly, his hands held up in a gesture of peace, and asked if she was hurt, if she needed a ride, if there was anyone else with her. She did not answer. Instead, she lowered her arm and turned her head slightly, as if listening to something he could not hear. That was when Marco noticed the details that did not fit. The wedding dress was not just wet, it was saturated, dripping so heavily that a puddle had formed at her feet, even though the ground around her was bone dry. The fabric itself looked old, not vintage but decayed, with threads unraveling at the hems and stains that might have been mud or something darker. Her shoes, if she wore any, were hidden beneath the hem, and her hands, pale and slender, hung limply at her sides. Marco stopped walking when he was about 10 feet away. Something in his gut told him not to get any closer. He asked again if she needed help, his voice louder this time, more insistent. The woman's head tilted further, and for a moment Marco thought she was going to speak. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed down the road in the direction he had been driving. Her finger was bone white, almost translucent in the harsh light, and it trembled slightly as it extended toward the darkness beyond his headlights. Marco followed her gesture with his eyes, But there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching into the jungle. When he looked back, the woman had taken a step closer. He had not heard her move. There had been no footsteps, no rustle of fabric, but she was now only a few feet away, close enough that he could see the way the water streamed from her hair in thin rivulets, pooling on the asphalt and spreading outward in slow, impossible patterns. Her veil shifted slightly in a breeze that did not exist, and for just a fraction of a second, Marco caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. It was not a face, or rather, it was something that had once been a face but was no longer recognizable as one. The features were blurred, smudged, as if someone had tried to erase them, and left only a pale approximation of eyes and a mouth. Marco stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, and the woman lunged forward with a speed that should not have been possible. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the wet pavement, even though there was no rain, no puddles except the ones that seemed to follow her. He threw himself into the cab of the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it with shaking hands. The woman stood directly in front of the hood now, her arms at her sides, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. Marco jammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as he pulled back onto the road. He did not look in the rearview mirror. He did not dare. But as he sped away, he heard a sound that cut through the roar of the engine and the hammering of his heart. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails dragging slowly across glass. It was coming from the back of the truck. Marco drove faster, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, moving from the rear window to the side panels, circling the vehicle as if something was walking alongside it at impossible speed. He did not stop until he reached the outskirts of Hagotnya, where the street lights burned bright and the roads were wide and crowded even at 3 a.m. When Marco finally pulled over in a gas station parking lot, his hands were still shaking. He sat in the cab for a long time, trying to convince himself that what he had seen was a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and bad lighting. But when he finally worked up the courage to step out and inspect the truck, he found something that made his stomach turn. The rear windshield was covered in wet handprints, dozens of them, dragged downward in long streaks as if someone had been clinging to the glass and slowly sliding off. The prints were small, delicate, and they glistened in the fluorescent lights of the gas station. Marco touched one with the tip of his finger, and it was ice cold, colder than anything should be in the tropical night. He wiped his hand on his jeans and walked around the truck, checking every surface, every panel. There were more prints on the sides, on the door handles, even on the roof. All of them wet, all of them impossibly cold. He asked the attendant inside if there had been any rain that night, and the young man looked at him as if he were crazy. It had not rained in over a week. Marco did not drive the Fonte River Road again for 2 months. When he finally returned, it was only because his boss insisted and threatened to dock his pay if he refused another route assignment. He took the road during daylight hours, telling himself that whatever he had seen only appeared at night. But even in the brightness of midday, the stretch near the old bridge felt wrong. The air was cooler there, the jungle quieter, and the asphalt near the guardrail was always damp, even when the rest of the road was dry. Other drivers began to report similar experiences. A taxi driver named Elena Cruz claimed she had picked up a woman in a wedding dress near the same spot, only to have her passenger vanish from the back seat before they reached the next town. A tourist couple from Japan posted a video online showing wet handprints appearing on their rental car's windows while they were parked on the shoulder. The prints forming slowly, one finger at a time, as if an invisible hand was pressing against the glass. Local residents who had lived near the river for generations were not surprised. They had heard the stories before. The woman in the wedding dress had been appearing on that road for as long as anyone could remember, always soaked, always silent, always desperate. The legend, as far as anyone could piece it together, went back to the early 1950s, though some claimed it was even older. A young woman named Maria, or perhaps it was Rosa, no one could agree on the name anymore, had been traveling to her wedding ceremony when her car went off the bridge during a storm. The river had swollen with rain, and the current was too strong. She drowned in her wedding dress, still clutching the flowers she had been carrying, and her body was not found until 3 days later, tangled in the roots of a submerged tree. The wedding, of course, never happened. Her fiancé waited at the church, unaware of the tragedy, until someone arrived with the news. Some said he threw himself into the river a week later. Others said he moved away and never spoke of her again. But Maria, or Rosa, or whatever her name truly was, never left. She remained on the road, searching for the ceremony that would never come, stopping drivers and begging them for directions, for help, for something she could no longer articulate. Those who stopped and tried to assist her found themselves marked, their vehicles daubed with her endless, freezing water, their minds haunted by the glimpse of that ruined face beneath the veil. Marco never spoke about the incident to anyone outside his family, but word spread anyway. Truck drivers talk, and stories like his have a way of traveling faster than any vehicle. Within months, the Fonte River Road became a place people avoided after dark, not because of the legend itself, but because too many people had seen her. Too many cars had been marked with those cold, wet prints. The local government dismissed the reports as mass hysteria, a case of suggestible minds feeding off each other's fears. But they could not explain the handprints. They could not explain why the asphalt near the bridge was always damp, even during the dry season. And they certainly could not explain the photographs, dozens of them now, taken by drivers who had encountered the woman and lived to share their evidence. In every image, the figure was blurred, indistinct, as if the camera refused to capture her fully. But the dress was always visible, white and soaked, and the veil was always there, hiding whatever lay beneath. Marco still drives trucks, but he has requested routes that keep him far from Fonte River. On the nights when he cannot avoid it, he drives fast, his windows up, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He does not stop for anything, and when he hears the tapping, the soft, rhythmic drag of wet fingers across metal and glass, he presses the accelerator harder and prays that the sound will fade before he reaches the next town. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In the dense jungles of Guam, near the limestone cliffs and hidden caves that have stood for centuries, another presence makes itself known in the darkest hours of the night. This one does not wait on roadsides or beg for help. It does not need to. It moves in a column of shadow and sound, cutting through the jungle with the precision of a military march. And those who encounter it are left with a choice that offers no real comfort: to lie down and surrender to absolute terror, or to meet its gaze and vanish into something far worse. The trail leading to Pagat Cave is not an easy hike even during daylight. It winds through thick jungle, over roots and rocks, down steep inclines that test the balance of even experienced hikers. The path is narrow and poorly marked, and more than one group has gotten lost trying to find the cave entrance hidden among the foliage and limestone. But for those who know the way, the cave itself is worth the effort. It opens into a vast chamber with crystal clear water fed by underground springs, a place of quiet beauty where sunlight filters through cracks in the stone and creates patterns on the surface of the pool. Local legends say the cave was once a sacred site, a place where ancient people came to perform rituals and pay respects to the spirits that guarded the land. Most tourists who visit during the day leave with nothing more than photographs and sore legs, but those who venture into the jungle around Pagat after dark tell a very different kind of story. Ethan Reyes had been living on Guam for 3 years, working as a field biologist, studying the island's native bat populations. His research often required him to hike into remote areas at night, when the bats were most active, and he had grown comfortable navigating the jungle trails with nothing more than a headlamp and a machete. He had heard the stories about Pagat Cave, of course. Everyone had. The locals spoke of the night marchers, a procession of spirits that walked the ancient paths after midnight, carrying torches and weapons, chanting in a language no living person understood. The rules for encountering them were clear and unambiguous. If you heard the marchers approaching, you were to lie face down on the ground, immediately close your eyes, and hold your breath until the sounds passed. Under no circumstances were you to look at them. Those who broke this rule, according to the stories, were never seen again. Ethan had always dismissed the legends as folklore, the kind of cautionary tales that every culture developed to keep people from wandering into dangerous places after dark. But on a Thursday night in early October, his skepticism was put to a test he had not anticipated. He had been tracking a colony of fruit bats near the cliffs above Pagat Cave, setting up acoustic monitors and recording their flight patterns. The work required him to stay out until well past midnight, and by the time he finished his last equipment check, it was nearly 3 a.m. The jungle was alive with the usual sounds, insects clicking and buzzing, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. Ethan had just started back down the trail, his headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the darkness, when he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was a rhythmic tapping, sharp and clear, like wood striking stone in a steady, deliberate pattern. The sound came from somewhere ahead of him, deeper in the jungle, and it was accompanied by a low, droning chant that rose and fell in waves. Ethan turned off his headlamp and stood perfectly still, listening. The tapping grew louder, and with it came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, many of them moving in perfect unison. They were coming closer. Ethan's first instinct was to call out, to announce his presence, and make sure he was not stumbling into a group of late-night hikers or some kind of cultural ceremony. But something stopped him. The sounds were wrong. The footsteps were too perfectly synchronized, the chant too otherworldly, and the tapping had a quality that made his skin crawl, not rhythmic like drumming, but sharp and hollow, like bone striking bone. He crouched low behind a thick cluster of ferns and tried to steady his breathing. The footsteps were very close now, close enough that he could feel the vibrations through the ground beneath his boots. And then he saw the light. It was not the flickering yellow of torches or the harsh white of flashlights. It was a pale greenish glow that seemed to emanate from the air itself, casting no shadows and illuminating nothing except the figures that carried it. They emerged from the darkness in a single, unbroken line, walking along a path that cut straight through the jungle as if the trees and undergrowth did not exist. There were dozens of them, perhaps more. It was impossible to count. They moved in perfect formation, their heads held high, their arms swinging in time with their steps. Each figure carried something, a spear, a club, a torch that burned with that eerie, sourceless light. They wore what looked like traditional garments, woven mats and shells and feathers, but the details were indistinct, blurred as if Ethan were looking at them through a pane of frosted glass. Their faces were the worst part. He could see the shapes of eyes and mouths, the outlines of noses and cheekbones, but none of it resolved into anything recognizable. It was as if he were looking at people who existed only partially, whose features had been erased or left unfinished. The chant rose in volume as they passed, a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the tapping of their spears against the ground sent vibrations through Ethan's chest. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes and follow the rule he had heard so many times, but he could not. He was frozen, his body locked in place, his eyes fixed on the procession as it moved past him with the inevitability of a river, carving through stone. One of the figures turned its head. It was a slow, deliberate movement, and Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat as the blurred face angled toward him. The chanting did not stop. The footsteps did not falter, but the figure's head continued to turn until it was staring directly at him, and Ethan realized with growing horror that the others were doing the same. One by one, the marchers turned their heads in his direction, their movements synchronized and mechanical, and though he could not see their eyes, he knew they were looking at him. The air around him grew colder, so cold that his breath misted in front of his face, and the sounds of the jungle vanished entirely. There were no insects, no wind, no waves, only the chant and the tapping and the terrible, suffocating silence that pressed in on him from all sides. Ethan tried to move, to stand, to run, but his legs would not obey. He was pinned in place by something he could not see, something that held him as firmly as chains, and all he could do was watch as the figures continued their march. Their heads still turned toward him, their faceless stares boring into him with an intensity that made his vision blur and his head spin. The last figure in the procession was different. It was taller than the others, broader, and it carried a staff instead of a spear. The staff was adorned with shells and feathers that rattled softly as the figure walked, and the sound cut through the chant like a knife. When this figure turned its head toward Ethan, the cold intensified to the point of pain. Ethan's skin burned with it, his lungs ached, and he felt something shift inside him, a pulling sensation that started in his chest and radiated outward. The tall figure raised its staff and pointed it directly at him, and the chant stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a void so complete that Ethan could not even hear his own heart beat. He thought he was going to die. He thought the figure would step off the path and come for him, drag him into that column of shadow and erase him the way it had erased the features of the marchers. But instead, the figure lowered its staff, turned its head back to the path, and continued walking. The chant resumed, the tapping resumed, and the procession moved on, vanishing into the jungle as suddenly as it had appeared. Ethan didn't know how long he stayed crouched behind the ferns. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning in the suffocating silence that followed the marcher's departure. When he finally managed to move, his legs were numb and unsteady, and he had to use a tree trunk to pull himself upright. The jungle sounds had returned, the insects and the wind and the waves, but they felt muted, distant, as if he were hearing them through water. He turned on his headlamp with shaking hands and looked at the path where the procession had walked. There was nothing there, no footprints, no disturbed leaves, no sign that anything had passed through. But when he knelt down and touched the ground, it was ice cold, far colder than the surrounding soil, and the coldness clung to his fingers long after he pulled his hand away. Ethan stumbled back down the trail, his mind racing, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He did not stop until he reached his truck parked at the trailhead, and even then, he sat in the driver's seat for a long time before he felt steady enough to start the engine. He told himself that it had been a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and isolation, and too many hours spent alone in the dark. But the cold was real. He could still feel it on his skin, in his lungs, in the marrow of his bones. And when he checked his equipment the next morning, he found something that made him question everything he thought he knew. The acoustic monitors he had set up near the cliffs had recorded the entire night, and when he played back the audio, he could hear it all. The tapping, the chanting, the footsteps. The sounds were clear and unmistakable, captured with the same precision as the bat calls he had been studying. But there was something else, too. At the exact moment when the tall figure had pointed its staff at him, the recording cut to static. A burst of white noise that lasted for exactly 12 seconds before the normal jungle sounds resumed. Ethan replayed the section over and over, but the static never resolved into anything coherent. It was as if something had reached into the recording itself and erased that moment, leaving only a void where the confrontation had occurred. The stories about the night marchers, Ethan learned, were older than the island's written history. The legends spoke of ancient warriors who had died in battle and were condemned to march the same paths they had walked in life, protecting the sacred sites and punishing those who showed disrespect. The rules for encountering them were simple but absolute. Lie down. Do not look. Hold your breath until they pass. Those who obeyed these rules might escape with nothing more than a lingering sense of dread. Those who broke them were taken, pulled into the procession, and forced to march alongside the spirits for eternity. Ethan spoke to several locals who claimed to have had their own encounters, and their stories were remarkably consistent. The greenish light, the synchronized movements, the faceless figures, and always, always, the cold. One man, a fisherman named Joaquin, told Ethan that his grandfather had seen the marchers as a young boy and had lain face down in the dirt for over an hour, too terrified to move even after the sounds had faded. When he finally stood up, he found that his hair, which had been black that morning, had turned completely white. Joaquin's grandfather lived to be 93, but he never spoke about what he had seen that night, not to his children, not to his friends, not to anyone except Joaquin, and only then on his deathbed. Ethan continued his research, but he never returned to Pagat Cave after dark. He adjusted his schedule, completed his fieldwork during daylight hours, and found other locations for his nocturnal studies. But the memory of that night stayed with him, vivid and inescapable, and he found himself thinking about it at odd moments, in the middle of a conversation, while driving, while lying in bed trying to sleep. He thought about the way the figures had turned their heads in unison, the way the tall one had pointed its staff at him, the way the cold had seeped into his bones and refused to leave. He thought about the 12 seconds of static on his recording and wondered what had happened in that void, what the equipment had tried to capture and failed. And he thought about the rule he had broken, the one unforgivable mistake. He had looked at them. He had stared directly into the procession, and though they had let him go, he could not shake the feeling that they were still watching him, waiting for him to return, to finish what had been started on that cold October night. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes impossible to distinguish. If you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description. Only if you want to, of course. I already appreciate you listening to my videos. But for now, prepare yourself for what lies ahead. The jungle trails around Talofofo Falls draw hundreds of visitors every year, tourists eager to see the cascading water and the lush vegetation that thrives in the humid climate. The falls themselves are beautiful, a series of drops that create natural pools where people swim and photograph the landscape. But the trails leading to and from the falls are less forgiving. They twist through dense jungle, over uneven ground, past limestone formations, and tangled roots that can trip even the most careful hiker. Signs at the trailhead warn visitors to stay on marked paths, to travel in groups, and to turn back before sunset. Most people follow these rules, but every year, a handful of hikers venture off the established routes, lured by the promise of hidden waterfalls or secluded swimming holes, and some of them encounter a figure who offers help they should never accept. David Chen was one of those people, and what happened to him on a Saturday afternoon in March would force him to question whether the man who guided him through the jungle was ever really there at all. David had come to Guam with his girlfriend Rachel for a week-long vacation. They were both experienced hikers, having spent years exploring trails in California and Oregon, and they were confident in their ability to navigate unfamiliar terrain. On their third day on the island, they decided to visit Talofofo Falls, arriving early in the morning to avoid the crowds. The main trail was easy enough, a well-maintained path that led directly to the falls. But David noticed a smaller, less obvious trail, branching off to the left about halfway down. The side trail was unmarked and overgrown, but it looked passable, and David convinced Rachel that it might lead to a better vantage point or a quieter spot away from the other tourists. Rachel was hesitant, but she agreed, and they stepped off the main path and into the jungle. The vegetation closed in around them almost immediately, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in broken patches, and the sounds of the other hikers faded until they were alone with the chirping of insects and the distant rush of water. They had been walking for about 20 minutes when they realized they were lost. The trail, such as it was, had disappeared entirely, leaving them surrounded by dense undergrowth and limestone outcroppings that all looked identical. David pulled out his phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal. Rachel suggested they turn back, retrace their steps, but when they looked behind them, the path they had followed was gone, swallowed by the jungle as if it had never existed. David felt a flicker of panic, but he pushed it down and told Rachel they would find their way out. They just needed to keep moving, stay calm, and look for landmarks. That was when they heard the voice. It came from somewhere ahead of them, a low, friendly greeting in English, and when they pushed through a cluster of ferns, they saw him standing in a small clearing. An elderly man, barefoot, wearing faded shorts and a loose shirt that looked like it had been patched many times. His skin was deeply tanned, his hair white and thin, and his face was lined with the kind of deep wrinkles that come from decades spent outdoors. He smiled at them and asked if they were lost. David felt a wave of relief. He explained that they had wandered off the main trail and could not find their way back, and the old man nodded as if this were the most common thing in the world. He introduced himself as Miguel, though his accent was hard to place, and he said he knew these trails better than anyone, that he had been walking them for longer than David and Rachel had been alive. He offered to guide them back to the main path, and David accepted without hesitation. Miguel turned and started walking, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had traveled this route 1,000 times. David and Rachel followed, grateful for the help, and for the first 15 minutes, everything seemed fine. Miguel led them through the jungle with the kind of precision that suggested he knew every tree and rock, every twist and turn. He did not use a machete or a map. He simply walked, and the jungle seemed to part for him. But as they continued, David began to notice things that did not quite add up. Miguel moved quickly, almost too quickly for someone his age, and his bare feet made no sound as they passed over the ground. David could hear his own footsteps, the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs, and he could hear Rachel breathing heavily behind him, but Miguel was silent. David tried to keep pace, but the old man always seemed to be a few steps ahead, gliding through the undergrowth as if he weighed nothing at all. Rachel whispered to David that something felt wrong, that they should stop and reconsider, but David told her they were almost there, that Miguel knew what he was doing. They rounded a bend, and David glanced down at the ground, trying to avoid a root that jutted out across the path. When he looked up again, Miguel was gone. He had not turned a corner or stepped behind a tree. He had simply vanished, as if he had never been there. David called out his name, his voice echoing through the jungle, but there was no response. Rachel grabbed his arm and pointed to the ground where Miguel had been walking. There were no footprints. The soil was soft and damp, perfect for holding impressions, and David's boots and Rachel's sneakers had left clear marks. But where Miguel had walked, there was nothing, just smooth, undisturbed earth. David felt his chest tighten. They were deeper in the jungle than they had been before, and the landmarks Miguel had been following made no sense. They were heading away from the sound of the falls, not toward them, and the vegetation around them had grown thicker, more oppressive. Rachel said they needed to turn back immediately, that this was a mistake, but when they tried to retrace their steps, the path behind them was gone again. It was as if the jungle was rearranging itself, closing off routes and opening new ones, leading them deeper and deeper into a maze they could not escape. They walked for another hour, their panic growing with every step, and then they saw Miguel again. He was standing at the edge of a narrow ravine, his back to them, his head tilted as if he were listening to something. David called out to him, his voice cracking with desperation, and the old man turned slowly. His face was the same, lined and weathered, but his eyes were different. They were pale, almost colorless, and they didn't focus on David or Rachel. They looked through them, past them, as if the two hikers were nothing more than shadows. Miguel raised one hand and pointed down into the ravine, his finger trembling slightly, and then he stepped off the edge and disappeared. David and Rachel ran to the spot where he had been standing and looked down. The ravine was deep, at least 30 feet, with jagged rocks at the bottom and a narrow stream running through it. There was no sign of Miguel, no body, no movement, nothing. Rachel was crying now, her hands shaking, and David felt a cold certainty settle over him. Miguel was not a person. He had never been a person. He was something else. Something that walked the jungle and led people astray, guiding them deeper and deeper until they could not find their way out. David grabbed Rachel's hand and pulled her away from the ravine, and they ran, crashing through the undergrowth with no regard for direction or safety. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, and when they finally stopped, they found themselves at the edge of the main trail, the one they had left hours earlier. Other hikers passed by, chatting and laughing, completely unaware of what David and Rachel had just experienced. They stumbled back to the parking lot, their clothes torn and their skins scratched from the thorns and branches, and they did not speak until they were safely inside their rental car. David tried to report the incident to the park rangers, but they were dismissive. They said that people got lost in the jungle all the time, that it was easy to become disoriented, and that there was no one named Miguel working as a guide in the area. When David described the old man in detail, one of the rangers, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, told him to stop. She said that others had reported seeing the same figure, that the stories went back decades, and that the man David described had drowned in the river near the falls in the 1970s. His body had been found weeks later, tangled in the roots of a submerged tree, and ever since, hikers had claimed to see him on the trails, offering to guide them, leading them deeper into the jungle where the paths twisted and looped and went nowhere. The ranger advised David and Rachel to consider themselves lucky. Most people who followed the floating guide, as the locals called him, were found miles off trail, exhausted and disoriented, with no memory of how they had gotten there. Some were never found at all. David and Rachel left Guam 2 days later, cutting their vacation short. David could not stop thinking about the way Miguel had moved, the way his feet had hovered just above the ground, the way his eyes had looked through them as if they were ghosts, and he was the only real thing in the jungle. The stories about Miguel, or whatever his real name had been, were well known among the locals, though few people spoke about them openly. He had been a fisherman according to the most common version of the legend, a man who knew the rivers and the jungle trails as well as anyone. He'd gone out one morning to check his traps and had never returned. Search parties found his boat, overturned near the falls, but his body was not recovered until weeks later, and by then, the stories had already started. Hikers claimed to see an old man on the trails, barefoot and smiling, offering to show them hidden waterfalls and secret paths. Those who followed him found themselves lost, wandering for hours in circles, and when they finally escaped, they all reported the same detail. The man's feet never touched the ground. He floated just above it, moving with an unnatural silence that made their skin crawl. Some believed he was a benevolent spirit, trying to protect the jungle from outsiders. Others thought he was something darker, a presence that fed on confusion and fear, luring people deeper into the wilderness where they would be easier to claim. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between, unknowable and terrifying in its ambiguity. David returned home to California, but he could not shake the memory of that day. He found himself researching the legend, reading every account he could find, and the more he read, the more convinced he became that he had been lucky to escape. There were dozens of reports, some going back to the 1980s, all describing the same figure, the same bare feet, the same silent movement. One account, written by a German tourist in 2003, described how the guide had led him to a cliff edge and pointed down, just as Miguel had done with David, and when the tourist refused to look, the figure had simply turned and walked into the jungle, vanishing between one step and the next. Another account from a local woman in 2009 claimed that her brother had followed the guide and had not returned for 3 days. When he was finally found, he was sitting at the base of a tree miles from any trail, staring at nothing, and he could not remember anything except the old man's smile and the feeling of floating, as if the ground beneath his feet had disappeared. David kept these stories to himself, but they haunted him, and he knew that if he ever returned to Guam, he would never set foot on those trails again. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as disturbing as that encounter was, there are places on the island where the presence of the dead is even more immediate, where the boundary between the living and the lost becomes so thin that even the ocean itself seems to mourn. Along the shores of Tumen Bay, where tourists gather during the day to swim and sunbathe, something waits in the darkness, a figure so small and so quiet that most people do not notice her until it is too late. And by then, the cold has already begun to seep into their skin, and the bay has gone silent in a way that defies all natural explanation. Tumen Bay is one of the most popular tourist destinations on Guam, a crescent of white sand and turquoise water lined with hotels and restaurants. During the day, it is loud and crowded, filled with families and couples and groups of friends, splashing in the waves and lounging under umbrellas. But at night, when the tourists retreat to their rooms and the beach empties out, the bay takes on a different character. The water grows still, the waves quieting to a gentle lap against the shore, and the lights from the hotels cast long shadows across the sand. It is peaceful, almost serene, and the few people who walk the beach after dark often describe it as one of the most beautiful places they have ever seen. But there is a section of the beach, near the northern end, where the sand gives way to rocks and the hotels thin out, that locals avoid after sunset. It is there, in the space between the light and the dark, that the girl appears. Jessica Tan first saw her on a Tuesday night in late April. Jessica was a hotel concierge, and she often took walks along the beach after her shift ended, using the time to decompress and clear her head. She had been working at the hotel for 2 years, and she knew the beach well. Every curve of the shoreline, every cluster of rocks, every spot where the tide came in strongest. On that particular night, the beach was nearly empty. Just a few couples strolling in the distance and the occasional jogger passing by. Jessica walked north, away from the main hotel strip, toward the quieter section where the sand grew coarser and the sound of the waves was the only noise. She had just passed the last of the street lights when she saw the girl sitting at the water's edge. She was small, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with long black hair that hung down her back and obscured her face. She wore a simple white dress that looked too thin for the evening breeze, and she was crying. The sound was soft but unmistakable, a series of quiet sobs that carried across the sand. Jessica's first thought was that the girl was lost, separated from her parents, and she quickened her pace, calling out to ask if the child was okay. The girl did not respond. She continued to cry, her shoulders shaking, her hands pressed to her face. Jessica approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, and as she got closer, she noticed something strange. The waves, which had been lapping gently at the shore just moments before, had stopped. The water was perfectly still, as if the entire bay had been frozen in place. There was no sound, no movement, just an eerie, unnatural calm that made Jessica's skin prickle. She stopped a few feet away from the girl and called out again, her voice sounding too loud in the sudden silence. The girl lowered her hands, and Jessica saw that her face was hidden behind a curtain of wet hair that clung to her skin. The child did not look up. She simply sat there, her small frame trembling, and the air around her grew colder, so cold that Jessica could see her breath misting in front of her face. Jessica felt a deep, instinctive urge to turn and walk away, but she forced herself to stay. The girl was a child, she told herself, just a scared, lost child who needed help. She crouched down a few feet away and asked gently if the girl's parents were nearby, if there was anyone she could call. The girl's sobbing stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse than the crying had been. It was a void, a complete absence of sound, and Jessica realized that she could no longer hear the waves or the wind or even her own heartbeat. The girl slowly turned her head toward Jessica, and though her face was still hidden behind her hair, Jessica felt the weight of her gaze, cold and empty and impossibly sad. The temperature dropped even further, and Jessica's fingers began to ache with the cold. She reached out instinctively, her hand moving toward the girl's shoulder, and the moment her fingertips brushed the white fabric of the dress, she felt a shock of cold so intense that it burned. She yanked her hand back with a gasp, and the girl stood up in one smooth, unnatural motion. The child was facing Jessica now, though her hair still covered her face, and she took a step forward. Jessica stumbled backward, her heart pounding, and the girl took another step. She moved slowly, deliberately, her bare feet sinking into the sand, or at least that was what it looked like. But when Jessica glanced down, she saw that the girl's feet left no impressions. The sand beneath her was smooth and undisturbed, as if she weighed nothing, as if she were not really there. The girl reached out one small hand, her fingers pale and delicate, and Jessica turned and ran. She did not look back. She sprinted down the beach, her lungs burning, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her, and she did not stop until she reached the lights of the main hotel strip. When she finally dared to glance over her shoulder, the beach behind her was empty. The waves had returned, crashing against the shore in their usual rhythm, and the cold had lifted. But Jessica's hand, the one that had touched the girl's dress, was red and blistered, as if she had pressed it against a sheet of ice. Jessica went to the hospital the next morning, and the doctor who examined her could not explain the injury. The blisters were consistent with frostbite, but the temperature that night had been in the mid-70s, far too warm for such damage to occur naturally. The doctor asked if Jessica had touched dry ice or some other freezing substance, and when she tried to explain what had happened, he gave her a look of polite concern and prescribed a topical ointment. Jessica did not press the issue. She knew how it sounded, and she did not expect anyone to believe her. But the injury was real, and so was the memory of that cold, silent moment on the beach. She asked around at the hotel, speaking quietly to the older staff members who had worked there for decades, and one of them, a housekeeper named Rosa, told her the story she had been dreading to hear. The girl on the beach was not a lost child. She was a ghost, the spirit of a little girl who had drowned in a boat accident years ago. Her family had been out on the water, enjoying a day trip when the boat capsized. The mother and father had survived, but the daughter had been pulled under by the current and had not resurfaced. Her body was found 3 days later, washed up on the northern end of Tumen Bay, her white dress torn and her hair tangled with seaweed. The family, devastated and grief-stricken, had left the island and never returned. But the girl, according to Rosa, had stayed. She appeared on the beach at night, always in the same spot, always crying, always waiting. For what? No one knew. Some believed she was waiting for her parents to come back, to find her and take her home. Others thought she was simply trapped, caught between the world of the living and the dead, unable to move on. Rosa warned Jessica never to approach her again, never to touch her, and never to look directly at her face. Those who did, Rosa said, were marked, and the cold would follow them wherever they went, seeping into their bones and their dreams until they could not escape it. Jessica thanked Rosa for the warning, but the damage was already done. The blistered skin on her hand healed slowly, leaving a faint scar that never fully faded, and at night, when she lay in bed trying to sleep, she could still feel the cold, a lingering chill that settled in her chest and made her shiver no matter how many blankets she piled on. Other people began to come forward with their own stories. A Japanese couple on their honeymoon had seen the girl sitting on the beach and had taken a photograph. When they reviewed the image later, the girl was not there, just an empty stretch of sand and water. But in the background, barely visible, was a pale smudge that looked almost like a figure walking into the sea. A local teenager claimed he had tried to help the girl one night and had watched in horror as she walked into the water without hesitation, her small body sinking beneath the surface without causing a single ripple. He had waded in after her, but she was gone, vanished completely, and when he emerged from the water, his skin was covered in frost despite the warm night air. The stories were consistent, disturbingly so, and they all pointed to the same conclusion. The girl was not looking for help. She was looking for company, for someone to join her in the cold, silent depths where she had drowned, and those who got too close risked being pulled into that same darkness. Jessica never walked the northern end of Tumen Bay again. She changed her route, sticking to the well-lit areas near the hotels, and she avoided the beach entirely after sunset. But she could not forget the girl's face, or rather, the absence of it, hidden behind the curtain of wet hair. She could not forget the way the ocean had gone still, as if the entire bay were holding its breath, or the way the cold had burned her skin like fire. And she could not forget the feeling of being watched, even now, months later, as if the girl were still out there on the beach, sitting at the water's edge, crying for a family that would never return. The legend of the weeping girl spread quietly among the hotel staff and the locals, passed along in whispers and warnings. Tourists who ventured too far down the beach at night were gently redirected, told that the area was unsafe or that the tide came in too quickly. Most people accepted these explanations without question, but a few, curious or skeptical, ignored the warnings and went to see for themselves. Some returned with stories of their own, of a small figure sitting by the water, of an unnatural stillness that made them turn and run. Others did not return at all, at least not right away. They were found hours later, wandering the beach in a daze, their skin pale and cold, their memories fragmented and incomplete. Jessica eventually left her job at the hotel and moved to a different part of the island, but she carried the scar on her hand and the memory of that night with her. She thought about the girl often, wondered if she was still out there, still crying, still waiting. And on the nights when the wind blew in from the bay and the air turned cold, Jessica would close her eyes and see that small figure sitting at the water's edge, her hair obscuring her face, her white dress soaked and clinging to her frame. She would see the girl stand and turn, reaching out with one pale hand, and she would feel the cold all over again, seeping into her bones and her heart, a reminder that some things, once touched, can never truly be left behind. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last two stories are different. They're quieter, but far more disturbing. The kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. Because sometimes the most terrifying encounters are not the ones that chase you through the jungle or drag you into the water. Sometimes they're the ones that sit beside you in silence, that smile at you from across a room, that wait patiently for you to realize that what you thought was human never was. And once you understand that, once the truth settles into your mind, there is no going back. The final part of our journey takes us to places where the dead do not announce themselves with spectacle or violence. They simply exist, woven into the fabric of daily life, and the horror lies not in what they do, but in how long it takes to realize they were never alive at all. The banyan tree in Umatak stands alone on a stretch of land that was once sacred ground, its massive roots sprawling across the earth like the fingers of some ancient giant trying to claw its way to the surface. The tree is old, older than anyone can say for certain, and its branches stretch so wide that they create a canopy large enough to shade an entire parking lot. During the day, tourists stop to photograph it, marveling at its size and the way the aerial roots twist and tangle into formations that look almost deliberate, almost intentional. But at night, the tree is avoided. The locals know better than to linger near it after dark, and those who have ignored the warnings speak of voices that rise from beneath the roots, whispers that seem to know things no one should know, secrets buried so deep they should have stayed hidden forever. Maria Santos heard the whispers for the first time on a Friday evening in June, and what they told her would unravel the careful lies she had been living with for years. Maria was a school teacher in her late 30s, well liked by her students and respected by her colleagues. She lived a quiet, predictable life, teaching during the week and spending her weekends at home with her husband and 2 young daughters. But beneath the surface of that orderly existence, Maria carried a secret that she had never shared with anyone. Not her husband, not her closest friends, not even the priest she confessed to once a month. 5 years earlier, she'd been involved in a car accident that had killed a young man, a college student riding a motorcycle who had swerved into her lane on a rainy night. The police had ruled it an accident, no charges filed, no blame assigned, and Maria had walked away with nothing more than a few scratches and a guilty conscience that gnawed at her every single day. She told herself that it was not her fault, that the rain had made the roads slick, that the boy had been going too fast, but the truth was more complicated. Maria had been looking at her phone when it happened, just for a second, just long enough to glance at a text message, and in that second, the boy had died. She had never told anyone about the phone. She had put it away before the police arrived, composed herself, and answered their questions with a steady voice. The investigation was brief, the conclusion foregone, and within weeks, the incident had faded from public memory. But Maria could not forget. She dreamed about it, replayed it in her mind during quiet moments, and felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest whenever she saw a motorcycle on the road. She had driven past the banyan tree in Umatak dozens of times over the years, never giving it much thought. But on that Friday evening, something made her stop. She had been driving home from a faculty meeting, the sun just beginning to set, when she felt an inexplicable urge to pull over. She parked on the shoulder near the tree and sat in her car for a moment, staring at the massive trunk and the roots that seemed to writhe in the fading light. She did not know why she had stopped, only that she felt drawn to the tree in a way that was both compelling and deeply unsettling. Maria got out of the car and walked toward the tree, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. The air around the banyan was cooler than it should have been, and the usual sounds of the evening, birds, insects, the distant hum of traffic, were muted as if the tree absorbed them. She stood at the base of the trunk, one hand resting on the rough bark, and that was when she heard the first whisper. It was faint, barely audible, a voice that seemed to come from beneath the roots rather than from the air around her. At first, she thought it was the wind, or maybe the rustling of leaves, but as she listened more carefully, she realized it was a word, her name. The whisper said her name, soft and insistent, and Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. She pulled her hand away from the tree, but the whisper continued, growing louder, more distinct. It was joined by others, a chorus of voices that overlapped and tangled together, some pleading, some laughing, some reciting fragments of sentences that made no sense. Maria took a step back, her heart pounding, and then one of the voices separated itself from the rest and spoke clearly, unmistakably. It said, "You were looking at your phone." Maria froze. The voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words struck her like a physical blow. She looked around, searching for someone, anyone who might have spoken, but the area around the tree was empty. The voice came again, rising from the roots, and this time it was accompanied by others, each one speaking in turn. "They know you lied, you killed him, you looked away." The voices were not accusatory, not angry. They were matter of fact, almost curious, as if they were simply stating truths that Maria had tried to bury. She stumbled backward, her legs shaking, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They began to recite details of the accident, things she had never told anyone, the exact angle of the collision, the sound the boy's body had made when it hit the pavement. the way his eyes had been open when she had finally looked at him, staring at nothing. Maria clapped her hands over her ears, but the voices did not stop. They were inside her head now, bypassing her ears entirely, and they spoke in a dozen different tones, some sad, some mocking, some indifferent. She ran back to her car, slammed the door shut, and drove away with her tires screeching on the gravel. She did not sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the whispers, repeating the same truths over and over, dissecting her guilt with surgical precision. Her husband asked if she was feeling well, and Maria said she was fine, just tired. But the lie felt hollow even as she spoke it. The next day, she returned to the tree. She told herself it was to prove that what she had heard was nothing, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, she knew the truth. The tree had spoken to her, and it had known. She parked in the same spot and approached the trunk with a mixture of dread and compulsion. This time, the whispers started immediately, as if they had been waiting for her. They greeted her by name, asked how she had slept, and then they began to tell her things about other people, secrets she could not possibly know. They told her that her neighbor, a kind elderly man who smiled and waved every morning, had stolen money from his brother 30 years ago and had never returned it. They told her that the woman who ran the bakery downtown had abandoned her first child and left him in the care of strangers. They told her that the priest she confessed to harbored doubts about his faith so profound that he sometimes considered walking away from the church entirely. Maria listened, horrified and transfixed, and she realized that the tree was not just speaking to her. It was speaking through her, pulling the secrets from her mind and reflecting them back, showing her that everyone carried guilt, that everyone had something they were hiding. The whispers grew more chaotic, more frenzied, and Maria felt herself being pulled toward the trunk, her hand reaching out as if guided by an invisible force. She pressed her palm against the bark, and the voices exploded into a cacophony that overwhelmed her senses. She saw flashes of faces, people she knew and people she did not, all of them burdened by their own secrets, their own sins. She saw herself as a child, lying to her parents about breaking a window. She saw herself as a teenager, spreading a rumor that had ruined a classmate's reputation. She saw every moment of cruelty, every petty betrayal, every careless word that had caused pain, and the tree absorbed them all, cataloging them, storing them in the tangled mass of roots that spread beneath the ground. Maria yanked her hand away and fell to her knees, gasping for breath, and the whispers receded, fading back into the soft murmur of overlapping voices. She staggered back to her car, her mind reeling, and she did not return to the tree for weeks. But the damage was done. The whispers followed her, not physically, but in her thoughts, in her dreams. She began to see the people around her differently, wondering what secrets they carried, what guilt they were hiding. She became paranoid, convinced that everyone could see through her the way the tree had, that her lies were written on her face for anyone to read. Her husband noticed the change, asked if she wanted to see a therapist, and Maria agreed, desperate for any kind of relief. But the therapist could not help her. How could she explain that a tree had told her the truth about herself, that it had peeled back the layers of denial and forced her to confront the person she really was? She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and her colleagues began to express concern. Maria knew she was unraveling, but she could not stop. The whispers had planted something in her mind, a seed of doubt and self-loathing that grew larger every day. The stories about the banyan tree were well known among the older residents of Umatak, though few people spoke about them openly. The tree, they said, stood on land that had once been a burial site, a place where the ancient Chamorro people had interred their dead and performed rituals to honor the spirits. The roots of the tree had grown through the graves, intertwining with the bones and the soil, and over time, the tree had become a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead. The spirits trapped within the roots were not malevolent, but they were hungry, hungry for acknowledgement, for confession, for the release that came from speaking aloud the truths that people buried deep inside themselves. Those who approached the tree with guilt in their hearts would hear the whispers, and the whispers would strip away their defenses, exposing the secrets they had worked so hard to hide. Some people, confronted with the truth, found a kind of peace. They confessed their sins, made amends, and moved on with their lives. But others, like Maria, could not bear the weight of what they had been shown. They spiraled into despair, consumed by the realization that they were not the people they had pretended to be. Maria made one final trip to the tree on a Sunday afternoon in late July. She parked her car, walked to the trunk, and placed both hands on the bark. The whispers rose immediately, welcoming her, and this time Maria did not try to resist. She spoke aloud, her voice trembling, and she confessed everything. She told the tree about the accident, about the phone, about the lie she had lived with for 5 years. She told it about the smaller lies, the ones she had convinced herself did not matter, and she asked for forgiveness, though she did not know from whom or what. The whispers listened, and when she was finished, they spoke one final time. They told her that forgiveness was not theirs to give, that the truth was only the beginning, not the end. Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face, and she walked back to her car. She drove to the police station that same afternoon and told them everything. The investigation was reopened, the case re-examined, and Maria was charged with negligent homicide. She pled guilty, accepted her sentence, and served 18 months in prison. When she was released, she left Guam and moved to the mainland, where no one knew her story and no one asked about her past. She never returned to the banyan tree, but she thought about it often, about the whispers that had forced her to confront the person she had been and the person she needed to become. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best. But not all secrets demand confession. Some are content to remain hidden, buried in the silence of abandoned places where the living no longer venture. Along the shore of Marizo, where the jungle meets the sea and the coastline grows rugged and wild, there's a fisherman's shack that should not be there anymore. It was abandoned decades ago, left to rot after its owner disappeared, and the elements should have claimed it by now. But the shack still stands, defiant and inexplicable, and at midnight, when the world is at its darkest, a light appears inside. A dim, swinging lantern that casts shadows through the sealed windows, and a figure that sits in a rocking chair, its back turned, waiting for something that will never come. The shack had belonged to a man named Vicente Cruz, a fisherman who had lived alone on the edge of Marizo for most of his adult life. Vicente was a quiet man, solitary by nature, and he preferred the company of the sea to the company of people. He fished every day, rain or shine, and he sold his catch at the market in town, speaking only when necessary, and keeping his interactions brief and transactional. No one knew much about him, where he had come from, whether he had family, what he did with his time when he was not on the water. He was simply a fixture of the coastline, as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the trees. One morning in October of 1987, Vicente did not show up at the market. The vendors waited, grew concerned, and eventually sent someone to check on him. They found his boat tied to the dock, empty and undamaged, but Vicente was nowhere to be seen. His shack was locked from the inside, the windows shuttered, and when they finally broke down the door, they found the interior untouched. His bed was made, his fishing gear neatly arranged, and a lantern sat on the table, its wick trimmed and ready to be lit. But Vicente was gone. Search parties scoured the coastline, the jungle, the nearby villages, but there was no trace of him. His boat had not been used recently, there were no signs of a struggle, and none of his belongings were missing. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, vanishing from his shack without leaving so much as a footprint behind. The authorities eventually concluded that he had drowned, though they could not explain how or why, and the case was closed. The shack was left as it was, too remote and too run down to be of interest to anyone, and over the years it began to decay. The roof sagged, the walls weathered, and the jungle crept closer, vines and roots slowly reclaiming the structure. But despite the passage of time, the shack never fully collapsed. It stood, defiant and eerie, and the locals began to avoid it. They said that Vicente had not drowned, that something had taken him, pulled him into the sea, and left only the shell of his life behind. And they said that at midnight, if you were brave enough or foolish enough to approach the shack, you would see the lantern. Thomas Wright saw it for the first time on a camping trip with friends in early November. Thomas was a graduate student from California, spending a semester on Guam to conduct research on coastal ecosystems. He and 3 friends had set up camp along the shore near Marizo, far from the tourist areas, and they had spent the evening around a fire, talking and drinking and watching the stars. Thomas had wandered away from the group around 11:30, walking along the beach to clear his head, and he had noticed the shack in the distance. It was small and weathered, barely visible in the moonlight, and Thomas was curious. He had not seen it on the maps, and it looked abandoned, the kind of place that might have an interesting history. He walked toward it, his footsteps crunching on the sand, and as he got closer, he noticed a faint glow coming from one of the windows. It was dim, flickering, and it moved in a slow, rhythmic arc, as if someone inside were swinging a lantern. Thomas approached cautiously, his curiosity outweighing his unease. The shack was in worse condition than he had thought. The wood rotted and the roof partially caved in, and the windows were boarded up, sealed with planks that looked like they had been in place for years. But the light was there, unmistakable, and it moved in a steady, hypnotic pattern. Thomas circled the shack, trying to find a gap in the boards, a way to see inside, and he finally found a narrow crack between 2 planks on the side facing the jungle. He pressed his face close and peered through. The interior of the shack was small and sparse, just a single room with a dirt floor and a few pieces of furniture, a table, a chair, and in the corner, a rocking chair. The lantern hung from a hook on the ceiling, swinging gently, and in the rocking chair sat a figure. It was hunched, motionless except for the slow, rhythmic rocking that matched the swing of the lantern. The figure's back was turned toward the window, and Thomas could see the outline of its shoulders, the curve of its head, but no details. He watched, mesmerized, and then he blinked. The rocking stopped. The figure's head tilted slowly to the side, as if it were listening, and then it began to turn. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He wanted to pull away, to step back from the window, but his body would not obey. He was frozen, his eye pressed to the crack, as the figure continued to turn, its movement slow and deliberate. The head rotated further than it should have been able to, the neck bending at an angle that was anatomically impossible, and Thomas caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. It was not a face. It was a void, a hollow space where features should have been, and within that void, something moved, something dark and fluid that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke trapped in glass. The figure stopped turning when it was facing the window directly, and though it had no eyes, Thomas knew it was looking at him. He felt the weight of its gaze, cold and empty and infinitely patient, and the lantern's light grew brighter, casting the hollow face into sharp relief. Thomas stumbled backward, his legs finally obeying, and he ran. He crashed through the undergrowth, not caring about the noise or the branches that tore at his clothes, and he did not stop until he reached the campfire where his friends were waiting. They asked him what was wrong, why he looked so pale, and Thomas tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. He told them about the shack, about the light, about the figure in the rocking chair, and they laughed, assuming he was drunk or trying to scare them. But Thomas was not laughing. His hands were shaking, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. One of his friends, a woman named Claire, suggested they go see for themselves to prove that there was nothing there, and before Thomas could protest, the group had grabbed their flashlights and started walking toward the shack. Thomas followed reluctantly, his heart pounding, and when they reached the structure, the light was gone. The windows were dark, the shack silent, and there was no sign of the lantern or the figure. Claire shone her flashlight through the crack in the boards, the same one Thomas had used, and she saw nothing but an empty room, the furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, the rocking chair sitting motionless in the corner. She turned to Thomas and told him he must have imagined it, that the moonlight and the shadows had played tricks on his mind, and the others agreed. But Thomas knew what he had seen. He had not imagined the light or the figure, and he had not imagined the way the head had turned, the way the hollow face had looked at him with something that was not sight, but something far worse. The group returned to their camp, and Thomas spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the fire and trying to convince himself that it had been nothing. But when the sun rose and they packed up to leave, Thomas glanced back at the shack one last time. The door, which had been closed and locked the night before, was now standing open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And inside, just visible in the shadows, was the rocking chair, moving back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. Thomas left Guam 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons, and he never returned. But he could not forget the shack or the figure in the rocking chair. He researched Vicente Cruz, piecing together what little information was available, and he found accounts from other people who had seen the light. A fisherman in the early 90s had reported seeing the lantern swinging in the shack's window and had rowed closer to investigate. He claimed that the moment he got within 50 feet, the light went out, and he heard a voice calling his name from inside the shack, soft and insistent. He had rowed away as fast as he could, and he never went near that part of the coast again. A local teenager in 2005 had dared his friends to spend the night near the shack, and he had woken at midnight to see the lantern glowing through the windows. He had approached, looked through the crack, and had seen the figure in the rocking chair. When it turned to face him, he had fainted, and his friends had carried him back to town. He refused to talk about what he had seen, but those who knew him said he was never the same, that something in his eyes had changed, as if he had looked at something no person was meant to see. The legend of the Lantern Man spread slowly, passed along in whispers and warnings, and the shack became a place of dread, a structure that defied logic and resisted decay. Some believed that Vicente had drowned, and that what sat in the rocking chair was his spirit, trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead, forever waiting for something that would never arrive. Others thought the figure was not Vicente at all, but something the sea had sent back, a hollow echo of the man who had disappeared, a puppet animated by forces that had no name and no comprehension of mercy. The truth, as always, was unknowable, but the shack remained, and the lantern continued to swing at midnight, casting its dim, accusing light through the sealed windows. And those who were unlucky enough to see the figure in the rocking chair, to watch as it turned its hollow face toward them, carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder that some things once seen could never be unseen, and some places, once marked by the dead, could never truly be abandoned. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best.